Choosing a memorial headstone, a tomb, and a location where a person is to be buried can be a cumbersome task. After all, it is to be their eternal resting place.
In the late Roman period, some families had family tombs in catacombs, like we still have today in modern cemeteries. These kept being reused or enlarged, like this arcosolium here in the main catacomb, in which troughs kept being added and dug at the back of the arch, while infants locally were dug in the walls and the facade wherever they had space. If, on the other hand, a new tomb was required, there were a number of choices and steps that had to be followed.
The first choice would be that of choosing a location. Roman law forbade burial within the city limits. Tombs and catacombs were always located outside the city walls. Rich families had their own private catacombs, with the option of being buried in public ones if they chose to. After that, the type of tomb to be used was to be chosen. This was usually defined by the social standing and wealth of the deceased.
The least expensive type of tomb in the Maltese catacombs is the floor tomb, a rectangular pit dug in the ground. These were usually dug in the corridors, which meant that people would have walked directly on your tomb.
Locally, shelf-like cuts dug into the walls were also relatively cheap, thus very common. Unlike other places such as in Rome and Sicily, this type of tomb was used almost exclusively for children and infants in Malta. The high infant mortality rate and the limited burial space would have meant that they were dug wherever space permitted. In some catacombs, loculi were the most common type of tomb.
Locally tombs were not the only tombs used for children. Infants were also buried in small floor tombs like this one, which kept being reused over and over again. However, they could also be buried in other tomb types together with adults.
The arcosolia were also very common, even though more expensive. These were tombs cut into a niche, with the body placed within troughs or on a flat shelf. The latter are, however, not very common, probably because the body would have been left to decay exposed.
Arcosolia dug into a small room were the predominant type of tombs within the earlier type of catacombs. These were, however, also very common and very popular in group or guild burials, where a room like this with arcosolia on three sides could then be sealed off from the rest of the catacomb.
Window tombs were another type of tomb, a more sophisticated type. As the name implies, this was made up of a burial chamber accessed through a window-like opening located within a small niche. This type of tomb seems to be of local origin, and although it is very common in rural catacombs around the island, it is not so frequent in the main Rabat catacombs. Apart from being a very intimate tomb, the popularity of this tomb probably lay in the fact that even in its simplest form, it was quite elegant. The entrance was usually flanked by two small pillars that could have been decorated with carved motifs, as was sometimes done with the niche itself.
For those who had money to spend and wanted to be noticed even after their death, the Baldacchino Tomb would have been the obvious choice.
The Baldacchino Tomb is a standalone tomb with a canopied roof, supported by 4 pillars and arches. Its proportions and decorations imply that it was meant to be seen, and it usually occupies a very prominent position within the catacomb. Most can be found in focal points of catacombs and were plastered, painted, or even covered by stone slabs to ensure a very smooth finish. The body would have been placed either in troughs accessed through the top, or in a chamber accessed through a small hole on one of the sides. They were usually closed by a flat stone slab, but a more lavish pitched lid called a saddleback was also available. To some, these tombs recall the modern canopied bed. Although we do not know whether such a bed existed in the Roman period, the headrests of the burials certainly bring to mind the beds of the living. These evoke the term kiometaria, or sleeping places, that suggests that for the early Christians, death was merely sleep before resurrection.
Unless you were planning to dig the tomb yourself, you had to engage fossores, a group of specialized tradesmen whose main job was to dig tombs.
Fossores, or grave diggers, dug tombs in the soft rock using tools that are very similar to the ones used by today's stonemasons. The process started off by first marking the edges of the area to be dug out. These extent lines were then deepened using a pick. This ensured that no damage was done to areas in which no excavation was required. They also made it easier to break off the rock in between these grooves. The pick could be used for a number of jobs, but was mostly used for works that required no elaborate workmanship. Its point was ideal to break off considerable chunks of rock, but ensured very little precision. The rough shaping caused by the pick was then followed by slightly refined work done by a dolabra and the kivil. The dolabra looks like a two-bladed axe and is a heavier tool than the kivil. This tool also had two wide edges, which were set at right angles from each other, thus making it particularly handy in cramped places like catacombs. Surfaces and the finer edges were then finished off by a number of chisels, identical to those used today, that offered a greater degree of precision.
This was the last treatment to be received by most tombs, leaving the tomb surface to look something like this. However, if you had enough money, you could ask the fossors to cover your tomb with a layer of mortar made of lime and crushed pottery. This smooth surface created the base for further improvements and further decoration in the form of painted decoration.
Some tools are also accompanied by inscribed motifs, such as farewell messages, symbols, at times religious, such as the cross and the menorah, or purely decorative elements such as decorated pillars. The job of the fossores was not only that of digging and preparing the grave, but it included also the burial and sealing of the tomb. The most common tombs were closed off by thin stone slabs set in place by mortar. Some loculi were closed so well that they are still strongly sealed and mostly invisible within the rock face. Roof tiles were also used in the same manner, although they were sometimes placed to form a saddleback. Fancier ways of closing off a tomb were also available. Once again, it all depended on how much one was willing to spend. Cubicula usually had large plug doors like the ones seen here, while some even had stone doors, complete with a key and lock system. Large monolithic sarcophagus lids were also available.